Keith Sampson, Senior Vice President, Competitive Energy Services. Looking forward to covering this information with you folks here. In terms of logistics, fairly low numbers here, but try to keep it somewhat informal. Hopefully catch some questions here towards the end. Feel free to submit your questions via the chat window and or email them into Casey. The last option could be unmute yourself at the very end and ask away. I will have my panel of experts here. And so for that introduction, my panel of experts are Zach Halleck, Larry Pignataro, and Jesse Newton. These guys are going to be talking through an update on what's going on with the energy markets. Oil, propane continues to change every day. Natural gas, electricity, cover some renewables, New Hampshire specific utility rate cases, and talk through some takeaways and some questions and answers. Those that know us know that we've always done these seminars. We've done them face to face. We pick a location. The picture shown here is from the University of Southern Maine, something that CES has been doing as long as I've been with the company. It's been great to interact with customers and prospective customers, talk through the issues, handle questions, and network afterwards. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that, but CES is and has been working remotely. We are staying safe at home, but we are very busy every day doing the good work that we do for folks and that we've been doing for 20 years. So very, very proud to celebrate this 20-year anniversary and talk a little bit about some of the work that we do for folks here. We started with procurement, and New Hampshire was a big piece of the deregulation market here in New England quite some time ago when competitive energy helped establish those deregulation rules. And since that time, we've grown. We have a procurement model that is probably one of the best that's out there. We pay attention to a lot of the details. We manage through these RFPs. And we believe that to do the best job for our customers, we need to remain supplier neutral, have transparent fees, and offer customized solutions. Custom takes a little bit more time, but it's that personal touch, and that's knowing our customers that we think adds a ton of value. In knowing our customers, we've learned over time that our customers do value other things beyond our procurement services, and that's how we've developed this suite of services that we call full service and consulting. And those services can be pretty vast, but generally we find that setting a budget and managing against that budget and then using that data that we've established through the procurement and through the budgeting to do financial audits, to help folks look at different ways to save energy through demand response and bill audits and help with understanding tariffs and things of that nature have all been good value services that help pay for our time on the job. The last piece we spend a lot more time is on planning. Planning for climate action, planning for energy master plans, looking at things like fuel cells and cogeneration, battery storage, and then ultimately solar PV, which has been a big part of CES for the past decade. So we're here. We're happy to help. We want to be useful. We want to spend our time in a way that the customers feel is good value, and we think that education is the big piece of that. And for that, I'm going to turn a portion of this over to, again, panel of experts. Zach Halleck, our Energy Service Advisor, along with Larry Pignataro, Senior Energy Service Advisor, to talk through the markets.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. So no mystery here. The major story in oil is that COVID-19 demand destruction is causing peak storage and thus lower prices. And so I want to start looking at the graph here. We're looking at U.S. crude oil stocks and NYMEX prompt month futures pricing. The blue shaded area here represents the 5-year range of oil in storage. And the dark blue line that you can see tick up there is the current year storage levels, which, as I mentioned, sharply increased during March and April, really as is COVID-19 demand destruction unfolded. Now, the green line laid on top here is the WTI prompt month, traded on NYMEX, New York Mercantile Exchange. And the story here is that we all know crude traded at negative prices recently. But really what it was specifically was about a month ago, the May futures contract traded negative. And the reason this traded negative is it was a clear indication and really a warning of just how scarce storage space was for oil at the time. Now, a quick recap, Zach, how do you get negative oil prices here? And what happened was traders, buyers left holding the May contract when it settled. On the last day would have been required to take delivery of the oil at Cushing, Oklahoma. But the fundamental problem was there was nowhere for them to store it. And so thus they had to get rid of that obligation. And therefore they were actually paying off-takers to accept the oil. Now, the OPEC Plus alliance, led by the Saudis and Russians, joined output cuts starting May 1st, which is why we had this fundamental crisis about a month ago. And they agreed to reduce their output by more than 20%, or roughly 10 million barrels a day. And to get a snapshot of our prices here, crude is currently trading, the July contract is trading at just around $32 a barrel. In fact, the June contract expired yesterday at $32.50. And the weeks leading up to yesterday, there was actually some worry about a repeat of the May plunge into negative territory as June came to expire, but we didn't see that. And that's mainly led by stronger demand than anticipated and less of a concern over storage as there was a month ago. So now I want to take a look at U.S. crude production and rig count, which is what we're seeing here. The gold line is the U.S. oil rig count, which is typically our best indicator of how the U.S. industry is reacting to the storage issue here. Now, before COVID-19 hit, oil companies were running about 650 rigs or so in the U.S., and some information released Friday of last week, the 15th, more than 50% of those had stopped producing, leaving only 292, so under 300 there. Now, the blue line representing U.S. crude production in barrels per day, you can see has been trending higher and actually clipping over 13 million barrels per day pre-coronavirus. But I do want to allude to the fact that before coronavirus, the number of production oil rigs was steadily trending down. However, this was mainly due to higher production efficiencies. And so I just want to make that point clear. Now, we're seeing some of our distillates here, ULSD and gasoline prices are near 20-year lows as the demand falls, and these refiners face these ongoing storage issues because we are running pretty close to the wire here. And we've seen a slight rally off the lows from late April here. And in addition to that, as these rigs are going offline, futures prices for associated liquids such as propane and natural gas are increasing as they rely in part on supply from this oil production. But I want to keep in mind we're still at a decade low, and I'll get into that natural gas specifically later on. The longer term oil outlook is steadier for now, and the outer months are in a classic contango market, which is to say that futures prices are higher than spot price, whereas the market is expecting prices to rise over time as demand returns. Next slide, please. And so I want to hit on some key takeaways here. I mentioned rig counts are dropping in response to falling prices even before coronavirus really took off. The May 20 contract closed negative, but futures are still within their 10-year range. The market expects demand to return. However, there's a lot of volatility expected given the unknown factors in the future. And really, it's a good time to consider looking at future open positions if you haven't already done so. And with that, I want to pass it off to Larry with some propane.
Thanks, Zach. So we'll talk about propane here for a minute. I know a lot of you are propane users on the call, so this is timely. Nationally, propane is traded at Mont Belvieu, Texas, and it's currently trading at roughly about 45 cents. Not long ago, March 23rd, we were at historic lows for propane. It was 20 cents, which is the lowest on record with the EIA since they started tracking Mont Belvieu pricing. So the graph you're seeing here shows the 12-month historical look at Belvieu pricing. Pricing's rebounded a bit from the low in March, and pricing is on the upswing as propane is heavily dependent on oil and gas production, which has curtailed. Overall, though, the market is down about 35 to 40% compared to the same time last year. We've seen a large storage increase due to global propane demand being down in the short term, causing some near-term pricing favorability. However, again, since propane is a byproduct of oil and gas production being down, propane will follow suit. Also, what might be even more important to watch is the propane exports. The US is the #1 exporter of propane in the world, and right now exports are down, but we need to pay close attention to the Asian market, where a lot of this propane is exported to, as they have been reopening manufacturing and processing, which are big propane users. Specifically to New England, the market's been extremely volatile and has made it harder for some of these regional suppliers to secure longer term contracts. Short term, we've seen pricing be favorable, so if you need a delivery now, could be attractive. The market's in contango where the spot is cheaper than the futures, similar to oil. So another piece of regional news that could impact propane supply and logistics as we go forward here. One of the largest wholesalers of propane into New England has exited the market. And I mention this because pretty much all of the major retailers in New Hampshire were buying from Plains Marketing, and they will now have to source their propane from other wholesalers. Now, this might not affect your price specifically. What I'm really getting at is the logistics piece. Usually there is enough propane to supply everybody, but the sheer exercise of getting it to New England via rail or ships or trucks can be logistically challenging in peak winter months. So if there are new wholesalers that are entering the market, they better be ready for New England weather, or there could be supply issues. So what's in store for propane as we go along here? As Zach mentioned earlier, oil producers are in a cloud of uncertainty. Rig count is down, production's down. If this continues, we could see some serious supply chain interruptions domestically for propane because of their dependence on oil and gas. Also, since the US is the largest exporter of propane in the world, producers could get stuck between meeting domestic and international demand as foreign markets pick up quicker than here at home. So key takeaway from a procurement standpoint, have a strategy and continue to monitor these markets. It's going to be interesting to see how propane reacts with all of the volatility in oil and gas and its dependence on both of those commodities. I'll turn it back to Zach to talk about nat gas.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry. So earlier I mentioned the drop in the number of operational oil rigs, and specifically I want to focus on the Permian Basin down in Texas, where these wells are not only producing oil, but other liquids, and natural gas really is a byproduct from this activity in the Permian. And since early March, we've seen about 20 rigs per week come offline in the Permian, compared with, say, the Appalachia region, a bit closer to home here, whereas in the Appalachian, we're seeing about 1/10 or roughly 2 per week come offline since March. So a lot of these rigs are really, a lot of the activity here is coming from the Permian. And so far, we've seen a decline in natural gas production of about 12% from the Texas region. Overall, since April, US production is down about 4%. And so we expect to see that as production momentum is lost, we would expect output to drop even further. And that concern has been supporting some upward movement in forward gas contracts and prices. But before I talk prices, I need to first address storage. Gas storage levels are a key component of the supply balance here, given seasonal demands for gas, which is why I need to address storage here. We're just starting into our injection season, spring into summer and fall, where we build our inventory as we head into the winter here. And obviously during the winter, we withdraw from our inventory. And what's interesting is right now, current inventory is about 20% above the 5-year average. And levels in April of 2020, right now, or at least a month ago, were nearly double what they were a year ago. And so what we're looking at on the graph is our gold line is our 5-year average gas and storage. And that's really what I'm addressing on the far right component, where we see our current gas and storage finally at a surplus. We've been at a deficit for several years now. And you can see that even further over on the right, where our April storage capacity utilization is nearly double of what it's been the last several years. So we'll be keeping a close eye on how quickly production curtailment could impact storage going into the fall. And so now I want to take a look at some prices here. So as with oil, we continue to see weakness in front month and spot gas prices, with a low point in the forward curve seen in early March there. However, due to the expected decline in production from the drop in production rigs, next winter and outer year forwards have begun to get some upward price momentum there, as we can see in our blue NYMEX winter 2021 line there. And so for the gas commodity itself here, we want to keep a close eye on whether market forces balance production or if they overwhelm storage levels leading into the fall and winter. And so there's two components to natural gas here. I've just covered NYMEX, the commodity that's traded, but we have to address basis. So in terms of New England basis pricing, we all know that the interstate pipelines and the ability for natural gas flows into New England are a significant impact on cost here. So as of today, there's two directional flows into New England from the Marcellus. Initially, we have eastward through Connecticut and Mass to receipt points south of Dracut, Mass. But then we also have westward flow over to the Don Hub there, over by Michigan, goes up around New England through Canada and down Portland NGTS or PNGTS there, up in northern New Hampshire into Maine. And so I want to address a few projects that are adjusting some of the flows here. Specifically for New England, for New Hampshire, sorry, we've got Atlantic Bridge, which includes final upgrades to the Weymouth compressor station, which will create for the first time bi-directional flow through Dracut. Now, this is expected to be completed by November of 2020. However, there has been some recent pushback from the town of Epping because there's been a large storage terminal that's slated to be there. Another project is Portland and Westbrook Express. These are expansions on PNGTS, and this will increase capacity and are on track to be completed by the end of 2022. And then also impacting prices further to the northeast there in Canaport, New Brunswick, there's an LNG facility, and due to depressed world LNG prices, the owner Repsol has been base loading gas more instead of just using the LNG for peaking, which has really helped alleviate winter basis price volatility. But overall, these incremental pipeline projects are more base load LNG injections will continue to flatten spot and forward winter basis prices. Next slide, please. And so a couple key takeaways from natural gas here is due to LNG, basis is flat while the commodity is remaining volatile, and we're expecting to see more volatility. But I don't want to distract from the fact that we're still at decade lows, and these futures are going to continue to test the decade lows in the short term here. However, the next 3 to 6 months are going to be very interesting to see how the injection and storage levels play into effect here. And so what can you do? You can keep your eye on the market and have a strategy. As simple as that, catch the dips as they come before things start to creep up into 20 and 21, as I alluded to earlier. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Larry, on electricity.
Great, thank you. So now we'll get into the really detailed New Hampshire specific electricity costs, and we'll take a look at the components that make up your bill. So this chart you're looking at here shows the cost of electricity supply in New Hampshire, and each color on these bars represents a different component of your electricity supply. So we're showing a year-by-year comparison out through 2024, and on June 1 of this year, we will enter the 2020-2021 power year. And as you can see, overall costs are trending down and flattening out a bit, but each of these components has a bit of a different story behind it. So the first and largest piece of the pie is the blue bar, which is the energy component. And this is tied directly to natural gas. Because so much of the electricity generation in New England is fueled by natural gas, we see this slice be very dependent on the price of natural gas. So where we are today, we're seeing a slight step down compared to the past couple of years, and we're seeing some price increase year over year. I just want to point out on the next slide, one more, next slide. Just want to point out the high dependency on natural gas in New England. This look here shows 2000 to 2025 and how the generation mix has changed over time. And you can see the purple bar out into 2025 is highly dependent on natural gas. So we've completely shifted to that fuel for generation. Hence the pricing is directly tied to natural gas pricing. The next major cost component is FCM, or forward capacity market. These costs, you think of them as a tax for future generation needed in the region. So what happens is the ISO looks forward and needs to ensure that the region has enough generation to meet future demand, and then charges you, the end customer, based on your contribution to the peak load hour on our grid. So ISO determines this 1 hour and assigns you a tag, or a capacity tag, based on your kW usage during that hour. And most of you guys know this already, but usually that happens on a hazy, hot and humid, sticky day in July or August. So a bit of good news here is that the cost of capacity is going down for the next 4 years, and most recently closed at $2 per kW, which is the lowest in the history of that program. And on the flip side, those who are managing their electricity load and capacity tag during this time, the impact financially to you will be less and less as we go forward because the value is going down. And as we get closer to the summer here, as always, CES will be providing our annual self-help notifications for clients who are managing their capacity tags. Many of these demand response programs are still a go at this time. However, with the uncertainty of the electricity demand due to COVID this summer, it's going to be kind of tricky to predict the peak, as many states are really just starting to open up and ease some of their orders. So depending on the weather and the demand, we may be calling you a bit more often this summer, but just want to remind you that that's going to be happening, and we're starting planning for that pretty soon here. And the next piece that I'll be talking about is fuel security. And what fuel security is an unavoidable cost to consumers starting in June of 2022, implemented again by the ISO to address gas shortages and price volatility. And it's kind of broken out into 3 sub-programs. And this bar graph is kind of showing what those programs and what they are, what the costs are going forward. But the first one is to support the Mystic Power Plant down in Boston. And that program is showing up first, starting in June of 22. The next is called Inventoried Energy, which is really just to have winter fuel reliability. And the last program is called Energy Security Improvements, or ESI. And the bar graph showed here are the costs, how they break out, and when they come online over time. So there is some overlap of these programs out into 2025. Now they are small and they're spread out across all of New England, but again, they are unavoidable to end users. So customers and clients who are shopping out their electricity contracts now, we're seeing these costs either show up as a fixed cost, included in your electricity price, or a pass-through cost, and it's all supplier dependent. So be aware of where these costs are going to be showing up in your bill going forward. Now I'll turn it over to Jesse to talk about RPS and renewables in New Hampshire.
Thank you, Larry. We head to the first slide. So similar to the other components that Larry just discussed, there's also the RPS component to your supply bill. So a little context, RPS is a state-specific statute that requires each electricity provider to purchase or acquire renewable energy certificates, or RECs, representing generation from renewable resources to meet a share of customer load. 1 REC certificate equals 1 megawatt of renewable generation. The cost to the providers to purchase the RECs are then passed on to customers on their supply bills, And we are projecting that this cost will decline over the next 4 years due to New Hampshire's relatively low RPS. So currently it's about $7, and it'll be down to about 58 in 2023, 2024. But if we move on to the next slide, we can see that for new renewables requirements, New Hampshire's RPS will increase from just under 10% today to 15% in 2025, and then remain constant. And shown on this figure on the right, this is among the lowest of New England states. It's shown in the gray bar here, and then we can see the other New England states in green, yellow, blue, and red. A low state RPS does reduce demand for RECs, which in turn reduces their value, resulting in reduced economic opportunity for renewable energy projects to get built in the state. This can partially explain why the development of renewables has been relatively flat in New Hampshire compared to other New England states. Last year, the New Hampshire legislature did pass Senate Bill 168 to increase the RPS requirement for new solar under the RPS standards from 0.7% to 5.4 in 2025, but that was vetoed by Governor Sununu. If we go to the next slide, we can see that correspondingly, as states with more ambitious RPS goals ramp up, ratepayer costs increase, while New Hampshire's RPS costs remain flat at around $10 a megawatt hour. Breaking it down a little bit more, the New Hampshire RPS statute has 4 general classes of certificates that suppliers must procure, and there are costs associated with each that are shown in the figure. It's broken down into Class 1 renewable RECs that have been online since 2006. There's also a carve out for Class 1 thermal, shown in the brown on the top of these bars. There's also Class 2, which is new solar, which has been online since 2006. That is shown in the light green bar. And then finally, there's Class 3 and Class 4, which is existing biomass and existing small hydro that have been online since or prior to 2006. So if we take a look at this figure shows each state's share of ISO New England total load over the past decade. We can see on the bottom, we have Massachusetts in gray, Connecticut in green, Maine in light blue, New Hampshire in red, Rhode Island in orange, and then finally Vermont in blue. In the past decade, New Hampshire's portion of ISO New England's total load has increased slightly from 8.8 to 9.6%. This trend has become apparent at the same time as other New England states have increased their distributed renewable generation and capacity, which has in turn reduced their load on the system. Meanwhile, the incentives to develop renewables in New Hampshire have not really been in place. Moving forward, if this trend continues, it could result in New Hampshire bearing an increased percentage of costs passed through by ISO New England, such as transmission. We also, as part of this, wanted to take a quick look at renewables in the current regulatory environment. So first off, to quickly summarize New Hampshire's net metering program. The current rules have been in place since about 2017. A few key points: eligible projects can be no larger than 1 megawatt, and every net metered kW, so every kilowatt that's exported to the grid, is compensated by a monetary credit equal to the default service energy charge, the transmission charge, plus 25% of the distribution charge. But notably, customers who receive competitive supply are not eligible to receive the default service component. And this restriction essentially means that you can't really net meter and receive competitive supply as many large electricity consumers do. So New Hampshire has not recently expanded their net metering program. In 2 different sessions, legislation has passed the New Hampshire House and Senate that would have expanded these programs, but then both times these bills were vetoed and fell just short of an override. One example is House Bill 365, which would have expanded the project cap from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts. Touching on a bit of current legislation that we have shown up here on bullets on the slide, we have House Bill 1218, which would increase the project size cap from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts, and also House Bill 1402, which would allow expanded net metering projects for municipalities. These projects, though, would only be allowed to basically be sized to fit the current municipality load profile. Unfortunately, Governor Sununu has made it clear that he would veto the expansion legislation again, and the House committee has voted for an interim study on the other piece, which has effectively killed its passage. So on the renewables front, unfortunately, there are currently limited incentives, but CES will continue to monitor this. We move to the next portion. I was also going to cover a little bit of news and updates on utilities in New Hampshire. So first, we have Liberty Utilities, which serves about 6% of retail customers in New Hampshire, mostly in western and southern areas of the state. This year, as in every other year, they've passed their annual retail rate adjustment. It's a cost mechanism to recover stranded costs and transmission costs passed through by ISO New England. These rates are in effect for 1 year, May 1st, effective May 1st. And then along with some small other adjustments, the net impact for a G1 customer will be about a decrease of about a percent. So if you used 100 megawatts monthly, that would be about a $76 decrease on your bill. In other utilities news, New Hampshire also has Eversource, which serves about 70% of retail customers. They actually have a more significant rate case pending that was filed last summer. It's a $70 million rate increase that is estimated to increase costs by about 20%. The utility has also requested that there are 4 additional annual rate increases to cover additional investments in the future. But Governor Sununu, via an executive order, recently has delayed the PUC, the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, to delay all approval of pending rate cases or any rate cases that are filed for at least 6 months. This means that the earliest we could see this hike go into an effect would be November 2020. This is likely due to a concern of how increased delivery rates would impact an already struggling economy. And with that, I'll pass it back to Keith Sampson for some key takeaways.
Great, Jesse, thank you. So just to summarize what we've talked about here today, most of these markets here, oil, propane, natural gas, they're in contango. The classic contango effect, where the near-term lows associated with demand destruction and high levels of supply have the market in pause because the market believes in the future they're going to see an increase in demand. We see the strategy here to look out and look at these longer-term opportunities and look for those dips as opportunities to hedge, if in fact hedging is in your future. The other option is to continue to ride these very low lows in the open and spot markets, or a combination thereof. With regard to renewables, especially here in New Hampshire, it's important to just keep monitoring this legislation and looking for these incentives. Clearly, legislation has sent the message that large-scale renewable projects are having their challenges in New Hampshire, and if that continues, really your only options are to start looking at national types of projects, out-of-region projects, to take advantage of the renewables market, which really gets you to a strategy and building a strategy. You've looked into the future. You've understood where you want to be in terms of reductions in your carbon, and ultimately stay informed. the quickest way to get into a project is to be planning it ahead of time. So with that said, I'm going to just jump ahead here to questions. So thanks again for those that submitted questions. They're excellent. And we're going to use our esteemed panel of experts here to talk through some of these questions. And for this first couple of questions here, we're kicking it back to Jesse to talk to us about how COVID-19 has affected regulatory as well as an outlook for solar incentives and net metering in New Hampshire.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So as I mentioned, at the end of April, Governor Sununu, by an executive order, has stopped the PUC from approving any rate schedules that are currently pending or are filed during the state of emergency that will increase rates for customers. And this is, as I said, will be in place for at least 6 months. During that time, though, the PUC will continue to review the cases. So we could see a backlog of changes come into effect at the earliest in November. On the legislative side in New Hampshire, the State House has been closed since March 12th, but is supposed to come back in session in early June. So this has put a hold on any legislative updates, certainly including anything on the energy side. To the second question for state incentives for solar, as Keith just mentioned, they are fairly limited, both because of the low RPS and low REC value and the net metering restrictions. As we said before, there are some pending legislation that could change, but still it's a political environment in which the likelihood of these bills coming into law and expanding the net metering program seem fairly unlikely. I did want to mention one small rebate program that is run through the state by the PUC that reopened in March for applications. So these are really only for small projects, residential projects, 10 kW and under, and commercial and industrial systems, 500 kW and under. And the entire program funding is just about $680,000. Awards to individual projects are capped at $10,000. So it is small, but is some recent updates. But as Keith said, CES will continue to monitor these developments and advise on opportunities as they present themselves.
Good, thanks, Jesse. I'm going to take these next couple of questions here. So we love this third question. Right? How do we better understand forecast for the future? And there's a number of different pieces that play into this. Jesse described a hold on this regulatory case for Eversource. So when one is building their budget as they look out into 21 and beyond, it's important to model appropriately for what potentially could be an Eversource increase. So we spent a ton of time right now doing these forecasts, helping people understand how their behavior might impact their costs down the road. And there's something that we've found just in a short period of time from tracking our actual projections is that a reduction in electricity and fuel consumption doesn't always translate directly into a reduction in cost. And certainly with natural gas, with the tariffs that are in place, as well as quantities that are required for oil, propane, and natural gas, those reductions aren't necessarily realized depending on the types of contracts. And with electricity, we always know there's a number of fixed price components through capacity and demand. And so forecasting correctly, running a budget backward, if you will, is a big piece of where we're spending a lot of our time as we help people forecast for the future. And the potential for, long-term energy savings, it comes out through planning. It comes out through looking at the markets and monitoring. One potential energy savings is to hedge when the markets are at their lows. And as everyone's talked about, especially with natural gas, which translates to electricity, longer-term hedges made at the bottom are a good way to lock in, so to speak, long-term energy savings. But ultimately, if you think about what's happened in New England, there's so much renewables hit the market, and there's still an abundance of natural gas just to our west, that there's still plenty of opportunity for optimizing savings by by using spot markets and different mechanisms like that. So those are some ideas to help answer some of those questions. The next question I would hand this over to talk about what does that winter 21 forecast look like, Zach Halleck?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. So I would say for the winter 21 forecast, kind of as it was alluded to before, in a fundamental contango market, we'd expect to see higher prices in the future. As you said, I would allude to catching the dips as we see this increased volatility going into the fall and winter here. But again, naturally, prices coming up off, a 5 to 10 year low is a good time to try to hedge and protect against some of those regulatory components as well on the electricity side coming up. But ultimately, I would say keep a close eye on the natural gas storage levels because that story will really impact us going into winter 2021. Also alluding to when Larry mentioning, gas being 50% or more of electricity generation for New England right now.
Excellent. Thanks, Zach. So with just a few more minutes left here, I thought I would just ask the group if anybody would like to unmute and ask questions. If there's anything the panel of experts can offer to help. Otherwise, definitely reach out to CES, reach out to the folks that you know at CES if you have any other questions. We're going to be distributing this presentation tomorrow. Casey will be sending this out, so you'll have the audio, you'll have the slides. As we looked at sort of this last slide, as we talk about electrification, this is what we're going to cover here. And on June 4th, for our last seminar that we're going to have here about sustainability, where we're going to talk about just this topic, right? What does beneficial electricity look like in the future as people start to reduce their carbon, the states reduce their commitments or increase their commitments to renewables, and how does one plan for the future here? So with that said, I again would pause to ask, does anyone else have a question that we haven't covered? All right, so I appreciate everyone joining us. Please be safe. Look forward to everyone joining here on June 4th, and don't hesitate to reach out. Let us know how we can help. Be safe and enjoy the nice weather for the upcoming weekend. Take care, everyone.